Okay. And first, welcome to all our friends, students, graduate students, friends in general. I'm very glad to start this series of conference that we call Auditorium. In this conference, as you know, we are going to hear today Dr. Alex Pomson, and in December 11, Dr. Alex Sinclair, Howie Ditcher in January 22, Alex and January with translation to Spanish, and in March 12, Dr. Tanya Zion Waldock. And now I am very glad to present Dr. Alex Pomson. Dr. Alex Pomson is first is my friend. He was my tutor in my doctoral, one of my tutors in my doctoral dissertation. And he was a lecturer in our international program, and one of his course now is running. And now I will read. Is principal and managing director at Process Consulting. He has published numerous articles and books about Jewish day schools and how they are experienced by students, teachers, and parents. And I think that all dissertation or all conference of Alex Pomson is very important, and this is a very important issue for all the educators and for the issues that we in our program are thinking about and working on. I would have to apologize now because I can't be until the end of the conference, but Netanel, my very appreciated assistant, the coordinator of the program, will be here if assistance needed. Okay, Alex, your time.
Thank you, Marcelo. That's always a lovely introduction when someone describes you as their friend. And I don't know if that puts you under more pressure or less pressure to make sure that you don't let them down. We'll have to see. But certainly really pleased to be here with you. As Marcelo said, I was teaching in the program for 6 years, quite a long time in the international program, and never say no to an opportunity to meet with former students and share some of what I have been working on. As Marcelo said, I spend a lot of my time researching what it is that happens in Jewish day schools, and what I thought we would explore together today is, what does it mean to offer a meaningful Jewish education in a Jewish day school setting? Everybody talks about.
Alex, one word before you start. I want to ask you to open your cameras, okay? Because it's not a pleasure for the lecturer to speak with the black mirror of this, and okay, and this is very important to us to see you, to see your reaction, okay?
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay.
I was going to say the same thing. No obligation, but really, I'm sure those of you who are teachers yourselves know that how challenging it is when you're looking at a screen with no, you can't see any body language. I like talking to myself, but it's much better talking to other people. So yes, people often ask, how can we make our Jewish schools, or how can we make the education in our Jewish schools more meaningful? And the truth is that word meaningful, I suspect, is not well understood. When I say I suspect, that's my British way of saying I know that it's not well understood. That people use that term meaningfulness in so many different ways, and I'm not sure we are all talking about the same thing when we use that term. So what we're going to try and explore together is the different ways in which we might use this term, right? What do we mean by meaning, right? So we're going to explore how we understand this term, and what does it look like when we engage in a Jewish education, or we provide a Jewish education that is meaningful. So that's where we're going here. And the resource I'm going to draw on in order to do this is a book that I recently published in partnership with a colleague in America, Jack Wertheimer, which we called Inside Jewish Day Schools. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just introducing you to this book. And then what we're going to try and do is take a look inside the book. What I did, like the first time I was asked to kind of explore this topic, was I looked for where the word meaning came up in the book. The book wasn't intended to be a book about meaning in Jewish day schools. But when somebody asked me, like, well, what's in this book about meaningfulness, and what does the book have to say about what a meaningful Jewish education is, I did a word search and looked for the word meaning to see where it comes up, or at least look for words that have the same meaning as meaning, right? So I'm going to share with you some extracts from the book that deal with this issue, either where meaning is present or where meaning is absent, right? Where something is meaningless, basically. And we'll see what conclusions we draw about the nature of meaning, or to be precise, what is it that characterizes a meaningful Jewish education? So that's the goal here. Okay, so let me just share my screen for a second. And okay, no, that hasn't come up yet. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so this book, Inside Jewish Day Schools, right, is basically built around 9 chapters. And you've got a list of those 9 chapters. Each chapter is about a different Jewish day school. So hopefully you can see the list of schools here. And in the moment, I'll be very curious to know if anybody has any relationship with any of the schools in the list here. They are all in North America. 8 of them are in the United States. 1 of them is in Canada. And as you can see, some of them are what we call lower and middle schools. Some of them are high schools, and some of them are K to 12 schools. Okay, so each of these schools, each of these schools, we wrote a chapter about each of these 9 schools. I think Julie, you're not muted, and I think we can hear a lot of background noise there or something. Okay, she's disappeared. Okay, so first of all, I don't know if you had enough time to see the names of the schools. Does anybody here have any connection to any of those 9 schools? Okay, that makes it a lot. Oh, you do? Marielle?
Well, I know people that work in that school, and I know students from the school, and I know this.
Okay, which school is that?
Pressman Academy.
In Los Angeles. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you in Los Angeles yourself?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Just a quick question. Everybody's from, are we talking about day schools in the United States now?
United States and Canada.
Okay, all right, good.
Yeah. Shani, you were going to say something.
I was just saying my nephew goes to Pressman as well.
So you're also in LA, or maybe
I'm in San Diego.
Okay, but your nephew is in LA. Okay, very good. Okay, so you would be entitled to ask me, why did you choose those 9 schools? Okay, like if you're going to write a book about Jewish day schools in America, There are other schools in America that have a higher profile than some of those schools, right? There are other schools in America that are perhaps more interesting than these 9 schools. So just to give you a bit of background, what we did was we talked to people, a lot of people, about what Jewish day schools do they think are interesting and worth looking at. And we asked them to tell us about schools that are not the wealthiest schools in America either, right? Because if we were to write a book about the wealthiest Jewish day schools, the schools with the most funding and the biggest budgets and all of that stuff, people would reasonably say to us, well, look, those are special places. They have special advantages. What are you going to learn about Jewish day schools in general if you're only looking at a small sample of privileged schools? So we went out of our way to study regular Jewish schools, regular Jewish day schools. So in this mix, the smallest school in this mix, lovely little school in Nashville, Tennessee, at the time of the study, it had about 75 students between kindergarten and grade 6, not a big school. And it is the only Jewish school in Nashville. And the nearest Jewish day school is in Memphis, which is 6 hours away or something, right? So it's a particular kind of Jewish school. Over on the West Coast, you have a school called Brandeis Marin. It's a community Jewish day school with 200 or so students. And interestingly, in this school, about 10% of the students are not Jewish at all, right? And then another 70% of the students only have one Jewish parent. So it is a school that operating in a very particular kind of community. So Brandeis Marin, you could say, is right on the far religious left of the Jewish day school universe. And on the far religious right, I don't imagine anybody here has children or is teaching at this particular school, the Yeshiva Darchei Torah in Far Rockaway, New York. Anybody heard of that school, by the way? Okay. I didn't imagine, it's not really a Melton Center kind of school. Yeshiva Darchei Torah is a boys' yeshiva for children between the ages of 3 and 25. It goes up to the age of 25. Okay. It has what's called a yeshiva gavoa there. And there are over 2,500 boys in this school. Okay. It's an ultra-Orthodox day school. So you've got Akiva with its 70 students or so in Nashville, and you have Yeshiva Darchei Torah with its 2,500 boys over in Far Rockaway. And then in between, you have any number of other Jewish day schools. A couple of you have mentioned the Pressman Academy in LA, which is a conservative Jewish day school. Have a couple of modern Orthodox day schools, one in Chicago, one in Miami. And we have one lovely school in Canada, in Toronto, the Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto, a school between 9th and 12th grade with about 1,200 students. Quite incredible how many students there are in this high school. So a real range of Jewish day schools. So before we get into the topic of meaning, I should give you a second to see if you have any questions about the sample of schools or anything else to do with the study before we dive into the content of what we're going to have a conversation about, I hope.
Well, I can only say that Pressman is an upper scale school. It's not middle range. Pressman Academy.
What do you mean by upper scale?
An affluent school, I would say. Comparing to other schools in LA, Pressman, I wouldn't say the rich school, but it's not the schools that you were describing. Okay,
well, it's interesting you should say that, because when you walk into that school, it's not a fancy school, right? It's really not a fancy school. And down the street, there is a much fancier Jewish day school, conservative Jewish day school, right? And so it kind of sells itself on being a little grungy and hippie and appealing to academics. So people still have to pay a decent sum of money to go to that school. So, the average fee in a Jewish day school is more than $10,000, right? So compared to a regular public school, it is, you could say it's privileged, but compared to most other Jewish day schools, it's not in great shape necessarily. Craig.
What strikes me when talking about a topic of searching for meaning inside a Jewish day school with such different schools, the what one calls meaning in one school is going to be very different in another school. Mm-hmm. And so what interests me was, with such a wide variety of schools, is there such a thing as common meaning?
Okay. Do people agree with that? You don't have to agree with Craig. Do people agree that, given the variety of schools here, what meaning means is going to be quite different in those schools? Stephanie, yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that it would be quite different because, the focus of the schools is so different. Yeah. And like you said, you have one school that you say is on the far left of day schools, and then you have the school that is ultra-Orthodox, and they're going to have certainly a different focus, and what is meaningful to the ultra-Orthodox may not be meaningful to the more left-wing and open. I don't want to call it left-wing. I want to call it more like open and accepting community. Yeah.
Fair enough. But anybody else on this issue?
Actually, I think that the meaning will be very similar, whether one is in one side or the other. It's to preserve Jewish education, to prolong Jewish education. Whatever you do it, the way you do it might be different, but I think the meaning, the core is the same for all of the schools, to Judaism to prevail.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm glad we don't agree. We don't all agree here, right? Because that creates a bit of tension. Now we'll try and see to what extent the two schools of opinion are correct or not. Okay, so let's take a look. So what, as I said, descriptions of very different schools, and essentially what we did, or what I did ahead of this session, was go through and extract quotations from the various chapters that relate to this topic of meaning. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do something. You can see this when your screen is off, admittedly, but if you turn your screen on, then we can see you doing this as well. So I encourage you again to turn your screen on if you can. I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you're going to be able to see 12 different quotations, okay, that come from the book. And what I'm going to ask you to do is read through them and select which for you best captures the essence of what we mean, how we understand the term meaningful Jewish education, or how we understand the term meaning in a Jewish day school context. Okay, so 12 different quotations. I'm going to ask you to pick out the one that for you best reflects your understanding of what a meaningful Jewish education is all about. Here we go. You see 12 quotations? I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let you read through these things and make your pick. Okay. Give you a minute more or something? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm hoping you've had enough time there. Okay, you'll see that I cheated a little, that the word meaning is not in absolutely every single quotation, but it is in almost all of them. And the second thing you may have noticed is that some of these things are inside quotation marks, right? So they are direct quotations from things that people said to us, whether they were teachers, parents, or kids, right? And then other things here are our own descriptions. And again, let me say, is like when we wrote the book, we didn't go out of our way to call out the presence or absence of meaning. And so it's been a very interesting exercise to actually go back to it and see how frequently this term comes up. And it came up quite a bit. But I'll give you a clue. Well, I'll say something now. It didn't actually come up in every single chapter. It came up in 8 out of 9 chapters. I leave you to use your imagination for the minute to imagine which of those 9 schools it might not have appeared in. Okay, so that's a bit of framing. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to leave it on the screen. I know we can't necessarily all see each other while it's on the screen, but I'm going to leave it on the screen and ask people to jump in and to select, tell us which quotation they selected and why it best reflects their understanding of meaning in a Jewish day school. Feel free to jump in, raise your hand, whatever. Somebody's got to go first. I used to teach high school, and in high school I would just pick on people to speak. So you might just be better speaking without me picking on you. No. So Stephanie, I'm picking on you, like, because you spoke before, so you're ready to do this. Yeah. Okay. And then we go to Jackie. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sort of torn between two of them. And they're similar. I identify with number 7 and number 12, having been a teacher in a day school and a parent of day school students. So number 7 says it's not good enough to cover material. I want teachers who will engage the students on a deep, meaningful level while creating meaningful relationships. And that's how I saw myself as a teacher in the day school. As a parent, I agree, you can get a good academic studies in every school, but in a Jewish day school, you discuss your religion, how to live your life, your history. So I see that from both sides. So those were the two things that spoke to me.
Thank you. So in this sense, when something is meaningful, it goes to a different level than what's typically on the surface, right? And there's something profound here about life, about relationships. Okay, thank you. Jacqueline, did you choose something similar or different?
Yeah, similar. I choose 7 and 9.
Oh, okay.
7, because I agree that it's not all about the content, and we have to get deep into it. And I choose the 9, but I will change a word. I work in a Mexican Jewish secular school. So I think that Judaism has a wide legacy to show the students. And we have to encourage students to make their own meaning, and they have to choose why they want to still be Jews in the future. So maybe we have the text, I know, but we have another big range of things that can be meaningful for students. That's why I picked the number 9.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to highlight how in number 9, it it's also talking about how the students have to make their own meaning of the text, right? So the teacher brings something into the classroom, but really the idea here seems to be that it's only when the student does something with that text, right, somehow integrates it into who they are, that they give it their own meaning. Yeah. Tamara. Yeah.
Well, that's why I don't know what's with number 7, but I also chose number 7 and number 5.
Okay, tell us about number 5.
It's meaningful unless the students are doing it or
Right.
understand it, at least make it part of their lives or integrate it in some way.
Uh-huh. Okay. Nice. So number 7 is obviously a very popular one. Okay.
Yes, obviously.
Okay, but they got to do something with it, right? And when doing something with it, they own it, and when they kind of own it.
Exactly. When it's meaningful to their lives, when they integrate it
Right.
into some
Right.
part of their life.
Okay. Shani, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I'm also debating between 5 and 12. As a parent, I totally
Uh-huh.
agree with 12.
Uh-huh.
But also as someone who teaches music, I'm the music director at the San Diego Jewish Academy. And it's not meaningful unless students are actually doing it. So we're teaching a lot of midot throughout the year.
Yep.
And, every time that we have, for example, Kabbalat Shabbat, it's not us who's doing that. It's actually the students who are leading it. So if they're not doing it, and if they don't understand the meaning, then it doesn't, So totally agree with number 5. It's not meaningful unless they do it.
Excellent. Okay. Let me ask you, well, does anybody want to comment on any of the ones we haven't mentioned so far? Did anybody pick out one of those that hasn't been mentioned so far? Marissa, you're adjusting your glasses. Maybe that means you want to say something. Marissa? No. Okay.
I actually also brought number 1.
Okay, go on.
This as a teacher, I don't know. I was picking 5. I was between 5, 7, 12. But I think if
Okay.
you thought about it, and number 1, I think.
Okay. Okay. So again, well, number 1 is a little bit different, right? It's not really talking
Right.
specifically about students, right? It's just talking about the kind of atmosphere in the school, which is different. Okay, I'm going to move this. Going to just press a button here on my screen, and hopefully, yeah. Okay. Hopefully, what you're seeing now, hopefully it shows up on your screen, is that 3 of these are now in a different color from the others. 3, 6, and 10. Okay. I can ask, did anybody pick either 3, 6, or 10 from their list, as their selection? Okay. The faces I can see do not seem to suggest that you did. Okay. So 3, 6, and 10 are different from the others, I want to suggest. Okay. That the word meaning in these 3 examples is actually different from the way meaning is used in the other examples. Perhaps, let's go to number 6, it's probably the most obvious. It's like number 6, the text has been formatted to indicate its grammatical root, a move that invites students to piece together the meaning for themselves. Okay? I want to suggest that meaning here isn't quite the same as meaning in the examples we've spoken about so far, right? I can make this painful and ask somebody to suggest what's in my mind, but that's a terrible thing for teachers to do, is to ask a question to which they have the answer in their heads and the students have to kind of figure out what's going on in their head. So I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to suggest that in 3, 6, and 10, meaning is less about finding significance in the material, which was something that we mentioned until now, but it's about making sense of the material. And in English, we use that term meaning sometimes when you say, what does that mean, right? We're really asking, like, what's the sense of that thing? So in this case, like piecing together the meaning for the of the text is like making sense of the text, or trying to understand what the text is saying, as opposed to saying, what does the text say to me, right? What is the text saying, as opposed to how does the text speak to me, right? And that is an important distinction. The same goes for number 10. Students are paired to study in Chavruta, a way to foster greater student independence in pursuit of the meaning of Jewish texts. In other words, in pursuit of trying to understand what this text is saying, right? We're not necessarily interested in what way might the text speak to you as a student, right? We want to understand, we want to try and help our students come to understand what the text might have meant in its own context. Okay, so what I want to highlight before we go any further then is that part of the confusion when we talk about meaning is that the word can be understood in different ways, right? It can be understood as making sense of something, and it can be understood as making significance of something, okay? So what I'm going to do is move along here and try and unpack what is involved in making meaning, whether in the first sense of making sense of something, or in the second sense of making significance of something. And I encourage you to jump in along the way if there are things here that are confusing or that you don't agree with. Okay. But you know what? Let me just pause for 1 second before we go any further, and check whether there aren't any questions, any reactions to what you've seen so far. Stephanie, yeah.
So it seemed to me when I was reading those that the three that you highlighted in blue most likely came from the Orthodox schools. And that because it seemed obviously the one that was for boys was from that yeshiva that's only boys. I do know that in conservative day schools they do have Hebruta study, but it just seemed like those were more connected to a more religious school. Not that Solomon Schechters are not religious, because they follow everything too, but that's how I took it. So when I was looking for my own personal connection, I saw it in a different framework, because I took it as making personal meaning, not looking at the meaning from the text, which is what those three seem to indicate.
Right. So certainly there's something to what you're saying in that emphasis in, let's put it this way, the further to the religious right you go, the less emphasis there is on making personal meaning, and the more emphasis there is on, let's say, unpacking the meaning in the text, right? As in making sense of something. But actually, one of those examples did not come from an Orthodox school. I honestly can't remember which school it came from, but it wasn't one of the Orthodox schools. But the other two certainly did come. So that, I think what you're saying there is an important observation, and it may be worth speculating on why that is, right? Is it that Orthodox schools are not interested in the cultivating of a meaningful relationship with the material? I'm not sure. I don't, but for sure there is more of an onus on unpacking the sense of something than in many non-Orthodox schools. I mean, if people disagree, feel free to jump in. I suppose that's kind of my observation. Craig, please. Yeah.
The one thing that was missing for me is that I thought I would see a lot of comments around the meaningfulness of school is one that, like you said, significance. When I think of significance, I think of how school life takes somebody and makes them an impactful person on society around them.
Yeah.
And doesn't only look inwards, but takes what they learn. So like sense making of words is one form of meaning, but changing the world around you because of what you've learned in your school is like making meaning. And I was surprised not to see more comments around that.
Right. We didn't describe such things. What can I tell you? I mean, this was a kind of natural experiment. Like, we basically basically went back to the text to see where the term came up, and like these were the context in which it came up, which is, you know, I suppose quite telling in that respect. Okay, I mean, like as you see in a second, meaning does have a number of potential different ways of understanding it. So let me just share my screen again, and we'll go back to where we were. Okay, here we are. Okay, so we've already established this distinction, right, between meaning as making sense of something and meaning as creating essentially personal significance for the individual. But each of those things it's really hard to avoid the word meaning, actually, can mean different things, right? So when you're making sense, when you're employing meaning to make sense of something, you could be doing a number of things. You could be contextualizing this piece, right? In other words, you could be saying, yes, this piece of Mishnah kind of makes sense in the context of the Roman period, or the period in which the Mishnah is referring to, right? Perhaps the most common way in which in Judaic studies, Hebrew classes, we kind of make sense of things is through translation. It's like the text is in Hebrew, we're going to translate it into English in some fashion, and that will enable us to make sense of it, right? So translation is probably the most commonplace means by which we make sense of something. And then explanation is, you know, contextualization is a form of explanation, but explanation is kind of like unpacking why this thing looks the way it looks. It may be text, it may be this practice, why we do this thing on Shabbat. We're making sense of it, right? We're not saying, so for example, why we might make Kiddush on Shabbat, we're not trying to cultivate, well, we might ultimately, but initially we're helping students understand what words we use to make Kiddush, what function does Kiddush serve, and we're not necessarily asking them to find special personal meaning in the making of Kiddush. We're just focused on making sense. So those are examples of how we might make meaning in ways that essentially involve making sense of things. But hopefully you would have seen that doesn't really cover most of the other examples of meaning making that we looked at. So what other ways? Well, let me just pause for a second. Anybody want to seek clarification about the making sense side of the screen before we go on? Okay, when it's quiet, I assume people understand. Okay, so there are different kinds of creating significance, right? Extrinsic significance and intrinsic significance, okay? Right, what do you think is the difference between those two things? Extrinsic and intrinsic. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Tamara, thank you. Go for it. Whoops, let me just go back up. Yeah. You're on mute.
Sorry, is that okay now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I would think that extrinsic significance is something from outside, not from within.
Mm-hmm.
From the context outside of the person. And intrinsic comes from meaning given from within the person.
Mm-hmm. That's really well said. I mean, that's certainly how I understand it, is like there are some things that can acquire significance for a group of people, and then there are some things that are like intrinsic to the thing itself, or the significance of this thing is in it thing itself and not outside it, essentially, which is kind of what you're saying. It's partly related to the next thing here, like, and this is a really big deal in Jewish day schools, is we say that we are creating meaning, but often what we really mean is that ultimately, eventually, this thing will have significance for you, right? It will be consequential for you. And then there are other things that are immediately significant. So like we, those of you who have experienced prayer in Jewish day schools will know that often, kids engage in prayer in school or are asked to pray in school with the goal that ultimately prayer will be meaningful to them, right? And it will have significance to them. And if kids are resistant, oh, but do we really have to do this? The answer usually is, well, eventually you'll understand, right? Or you'll get it eventually, right? And that's painful. But when you think about it, there's a lot of Jewish education where the cultivating of meaning is of that kind, of the ultimately consequential kind. And not all of the meaning we cultivate in schools, and I'm being polite here, is immediately consequential, right? Has immediate personal significance for the individual. So when you say to yourself, yes, I'm trying to cultivate meaning for my students, right? It's an interesting question as to whether you mean ultimately or immediately. Okay? I hope so far this makes sense. Okay. Now, how do we do that? In what ways do we cultivate meaning that's ultimately consequential, right? Often it is by a lot of what goes on in schools is of this kind. We help our kids become familiar with certain rituals. We help them learn how to find their way around the text. We help them become fluent in the language, or we help them learn how to act in certain kinds of ways. And we kind of saying, don't worry if all of this stuff isn't important right now or isn't significant to you right now. Eventually it will be. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, right? What I am saying, though, is that if we only do that, we are asking our students to be incredibly patient, right? And there's a concept in English, delayed gratification, right? It's not so much an American concept, but the best way to understand it, I often try and explain this to people, is the difference between America and England. I come from England, as you can tell from my accent, is that in England, one of the most beloved sports is cricket. Cricket is at its highest level, is a game that's played over 5 days, the same game, and it can end in a draw, a tie, right? That's what you call delayed gratification. And that's what a lot of Jewish day school education is like, right? In America, that would never fly, right? You play baseball, there's got to be a winner. So you go extra innings so there can be a winner, right? There's got to be immediate consequences here, right? So if that's for most Americans, it's certainly for American students. And delaying the consequences or the significance repeatedly we're going to lose our students very quickly. So what we need to look for are opportunities to cultivate intrinsic and immediate significance for our students, right? And hopefully this now connects to some of the things that you said earlier on, right? Here are 3 examples. They're not the only examples of how we go about cultivating immediate significance, right? We make something inspiring, or we inspire our students to go and do something straight away, right? Or by doing something, it becomes inspiring. Like some of you said that right early on. It's like by doing, it becomes meaningful. Or by clarifying, we help our students see depth in something that they didn't previously see, right? It assumes a meaning for them. It's not just understanding what this thing means in and of itself, but it's like seeing something deeper, clarifying, enable them to see something that actually speaks to them. Again, I think a couple of you picked out one of the quotations that connects to that, that expresses that. And then lastly, the last example here is connecting. It's like something becomes immediately meaningful when our students form a relationship to it. They connect to it, they feel part of it, they feel that this expresses who they are, right? Those are all instances, those are all examples of teaching that is immediately consequential. Okay. All right, I will pause for a second. I'm going to leave it on the screen so that you can still see it. And I don't know how many of you are teachers, were teachers, but if you think about the relative balance between these things, am I being overly critical and pessimistic about Jewish day schools to argue that a lot of the meaning making is focused on extrinsic or ultimately consequential significance, or not? Like, am I being unduly harsh about what I'm claiming here? Let me put it like that. Anybody want to offer a judgment?
No, I think you're right. I absolutely think you're right.
Okay.
Partly. Like, there's a lot of connecting people to feel part of a community, which is immediate.
Yeah, right. So that is one aspect of Jewish day school education that's very powerful. Right. So Craig, you and I were involved in a study. Well, I'm thinking actually of the United study. We did the study of Jewish day schools around the world. And we found that when you ask Jewish day school students what they most value about their Jewish day school education, one of the two highest scores was the sense of belonging somewhere, right? So by being in a Jewish day school, there is an opportunity to acquire immediate meaning, right? A sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Like, if you ask people, like, what might be one of the highest order goals in any kind of education, the idea that somebody is enabled to feel part of something larger than themselves, like, that's a really big deal in life, right? It's a really powerful way of enabling someone to find self, right? To find
absolutely
meaning.
Especially if you can anchor somebody's life in the midst of a narrative of a story, and give them a something within a part of that great story.
Right.
It's something incredible you can do for someone.
Right, exactly. I mean, so you could argue that the Jewish day school is good at that kind of thing. The Jewish studies classroom might be less effective at that kind of thing, right? So the Jewish studies classroom is probably focused more on this. I hope you can see my arrow, and less on this. But being in a Jewish day school, there are so many of these other experiences you have in school besides sitting in classrooms that do offer immediate significance. Okay, so if you have a particularly curious mind, you may be asking yourself, well, there's a lot of empty space over here on the screen, right? So is that because just that's how it's formatted, or is there more to say? Okay, so there are two more things to explore here. First of all, what is it, what makes it difficult to cultivate meaning in schools, right? Number one. And then secondly, is there a dark side to our interest in cultivating meaning? Like, I work, in my work, I have, one of my clients has been an organization that's really obsessive about meaning, right? And, you know, you can go too far with that stuff sometimes. So let's take a look, first of all, at the obstacles to meaning. Okay, so what gets in the way of cultivating meaning in a Jewish day school? So the most obvious example is prayer, right? And the challenge with prayer is that it gets routinized, right? You do it over and over again. And when you do something over and over again, it kind of loses the spark, right? And it just becomes an obligation rather than something that's of particular value to you. Okay, so that is quite common. Secondly, culturally inaccessible. It's very hard for something to have meaning if it comes from an alien culture. It comes from a different time. Like I mentioned, let's make sense of that Mishnah in its time, but maybe that time is too far removed from today. And our students just don't see how that speaks to this. So if we're dealing with sacrifice in the temple, like, wait a minute, like that's just a different cultural context from our current context. Why would that be meaningful to my students, right? Then you've got developmentally inappropriate, right? So that can be any number of things. Like if you think about, I don't know, a lot of Jewish content. I'm trying to think of a good example. I suppose take from a recent Torah portion, the Akedah, the concept of offering up your son, like that. You know, you got to have a certain maturity to be able to understand what was going on there, what the issues are, what makes this so profound. There's a lot that we teach just over our students' heads, and so it's hard to, or a lot of the things we are required to teach our students are challenging for them given their developmental readiness. Okay, personally irrelevant, like you can teach Shabbat, but a student says like, we don't do that stuff in our house, like it's not relevant, right? How do you make something that's not part of someone's life into something that is meaningful when it's not relevant to them? And then last but not least, something I already mentioned, is like, if the meaning is too long coming, right, it never kicks in. It's delayed too long. You never find the meaning because you're always promised that it's going to be in 5 days' time, 5 years' time, etc. Okay, so it is challenging. I'm not saying this is because teachers are incompetent. Far from saying that. I'm saying that so much of what is the content of Jewish education, whether in terms of text or in terms of practices, is difficult to find meaning in because of these reasons. Okay? Does anybody have anything else that might get in the way of, that might obstruct the making of meaning, by the way, that hasn't been mentioned here?
Yes.
Okay.
I would like
Jacqueline,
to add something. Yeah. Yes. Like there are like external factors, like the way their parents think about Judaism in their houses, or maybe if they belong to a Tnuah or to a congregation.
Yeah.
A lot of external factors.
Yep. That's great. Well, I'm not sure it is great, but you know what I mean. That's a good answer. Like, that's part of what contributes to something being personally irrelevant, right? It's that in the world that the child is being raised in, this is something that doesn't have, that isn't relevant, right? And if it's not relevant, then it's very hard to find meaning in that thing. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great example. Does anybody else want to add? Are there any other obstacles here? Okay, so we're still left with one question, right? Or no, well, there are a few questions still, but if we do aspire to create meaning in schools, right? Hopefully, we've seen evidence of what that might look like on the previous screen, and we've also seen we can also see right now what some of those things are that get in the way of cultivating meaning. Okay, but I just want to highlight why I believe that we've got to be careful in our pursuit of meaning for students. Okay, and here are 3 things. Okay, so what are the downsides, essentially? So here's the thing. They don't all quite mean the same thing, but they are related. So what do I mean by presentism? It's like saying if we try and teach something with the goal of the student finding how that speaks to them today, we are essentially there's a danger of distorting the thing that we're teaching about. In other words, instead of saying, I'm going to teach you about, I don't know, Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, right? And instead I say, like, how do you think the concept of being released from slavery is expressed in our lives today, right? Now, there's no question that the Yetziat Mitzrayim, that concept, is a powerful one that has echoed over the ages, right? But if ultimately our goal in teaching about it is how does it speak to us today, there's a danger in our making the focus of our teaching the present moment and losing sight of where this thing originated or the original context for this thing, right? And a danger here is effectively self-absorption, is that we are conveying a message to our students that things only are important if they speak to you. And if they don't speak to you, they're not important, right? I mean, you know, we're basically encouraging our students to be self-absorbed. I can give you a most horrific example that I observed in the course of gathering data for this book. So my colleague Jacques and I, basically each of us visited these 9 schools for either a week at a time or 3 days at a time, depending on who was going to be the lead writer for the chapter. And I was sitting in a classroom that was a social studies history classroom where they were talking about concepts in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, and they were talking about Kristallnacht, the Nuremberg laws. I can't even remember what all of the concepts were, right? But the task the teacher gave the kids was, give me an example of how the concept of Kristallnacht is present in your life, right? Okay. Or Nuremberg laws. Well, it's when my parents tell me one day that I'm not allowed to do this, and previously they told me I could do it, right? So like, I get where the teacher was coming from. The teacher wanted to enable the students to find personal meaning in a historical event, right? But we now feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? Talk about self-absorption and presentism. It's like, wait a second, like that's not, you don't do that, right? It's shocking, but it's a very helpful, I'm not making it up, I promise. It's a very helpful example of when you can go too far in trying to cultivate meaning for your students, right? So ephemeral is a fancy word for saying it's very short-lived. It's like a short-lived pleasure, right? Ephemeral is, oh yeah, this is really valuable right now, and then it's not valuable anymore, right? So again, like the search for, helping people make meaning may be like, oh yeah, this is meaningful for me today, but tomorrow it might not be so meaningful for me, or in a year's time, it might not be so meaningful. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be trying to cultivate meaning for our students, but if that is all we are doing, there is a danger of our conveying a message that they are the only thing that counts, right? Certainly we want our education to be child-centered, to be able to speak to kids where they are, where they're situated, absolutely. But if in doing so, we kind of distort how we understand something or how they come to understand something as only having significance in their lives, then we have a problem on our hands. Okay, that's the model. Hopefully it's a kind of map to how to navigate your way to cultivating meaning in a Jewish day school. I tell you what, I will put my email address in the chat box, and if you want me to send you a copy of the slides, you can take a photo, that's true, but if you want to take a copy of the slides, I'm happy to do that too. Okay, so by way of kind of wrapping up here, let me ask the following questions. Where are you now in relation to meaning compared to where you were an hour ago? Are you more committed to cultivating meaning in your students' classrooms? or in your children, interested in there being meaning in your children's classrooms? Or are you now saying, maybe I don't want so much of that? Where does this leave you? Yeah. Maria, yeah.
So I'm debating with presentism.
Go on.
Very much presentism. I'm debating with that. That's what it left. Because as far as meaning, I navigated what you discussed.
Yeah.
I was happy to feel that.
Yeah.
I'm in the right path for creating meaning. I mean, I find some of these things. I'm debating very much with presentism. I feel that that's the key that I need to find. I'm not sure if there is a line that I can make it about the student and the empathy I feel about it. I don't understand still 100% when it becomes very dangerous. That's what it left me now to.
Okay.
With myself.
Good question. I can't promise you answers, but coming away with a good question is a good thing. Tamara, yeah.
I still think that giving meaning is absolutely essential
without
being absurd and without comparing uncomparable things.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't ask a student nowadays to compare to Kristallnacht taking this to the extreme or to any other experience. That's ridiculous. It's incomparable.
Yeah. Right.
So but I still do think that it's meaningful if you take it to their reality, their lives, or their context, even if they don't feel it. For instance, you could compare it to another war. You could take it to the Syria example, but not to their reality. Not everything has to be around themselves, but yes, to a context that they do understand.
Very good. That's great. That's very helpful. Anybody else? Yeah, Stephanie, please.
I think what I found in the students is that they are very self-absorbed. And so they see everything about themselves. So if we're trying to give them greater meaning, then sometimes we have to teach around it before we can get into it. We have to teach them how to have empathy. We have to teach them how to relate to things that are not just about themselves. Nice. And I think that's the biggest challenge. You know, we did a lot with mindfulness and I taught Musar, you know, some concepts of Musar to the kids, trying to get them outside of their little bubbles that are all about themselves. And, you know, as a teacher, I found a lot of parents enabling the negative behaviors that were all about themselves instead of being able to empathize and look at greater things and things that affected them as a Jew versus them as just an American kid. So I think that's really the challenge that I saw in the Jewish, you know, in the school where I taught. So I think that is part of the downsides, because you don't want to make it too simple and too small, but you need to be able to build their comprehension of the bigger picture and how it does affect them. Because once they're out of that little bubble of the Jewish day school and they get into the university setting, there are so many of them that are facing relevant problems of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel. So how do you build that when they're in the bubble? It's a little bit challenging, unless it's happening in their own community, which unfortunately is happening now in our own communities in the US. But, you know, 2 years ago, pre-COVID, you know, it was different. And, you know, now post-COVID, kids are even more self-absorbed and more about themselves. They have to learn how to socialize and interact and think about others. So,
so you've highlighted a whole range of issues that certainly make it challenging working with young kids today, and how important the work of educators is today, given our, you know, all of our students have come out of 2 years of isolation, effectively some form of isolation, some, you know, enforced self-absorption in many ways. So thank you. Like, this isn't easy, but at the same time, I think what we've also highlighted and what others have highlighted is why, even with the challenges and even with the dangers, let's say, this is worthwhile, right? Because ultimately, if we want what it is that we're teaching our students to speak to them and to have significance for them in their lives and for them to take ownership of those things, then it's important that they do find personal meaning. Because it's difficult to imagine a scenario where, without cultivating those relationships, they'll regard these things as important, right? So certainly this is a critical piece in enabling Jewish education to speak to young people. Okay, I checked with Marcelo ahead of time, like how long we're supposed to go here. He told me, like, as long as we go over an hour, this is kosher. So I don't know, like, if you have any questions for me before we wrap this up, you should let me know.